We continue with our series, Polygamy, Practical Problems and Scriptural Prohibitions. Our sermon title this morning, Monogamy, Obligatory or Optional? Monogamy, obligatory or optional? Because if it's optional, then I guess polygamy is okay, right? Does the scripture make that case? Before I get into that too much this morning, I want to simply go over what we talked about last week. Because last week what we did was we mentioned that at least in one prominent group, biblicalfamilies.org, the best case by their own admission they can make for polygamy is from 2 Samuel 12, verse 8. So we looked at that last week and we saw 4 reasons why that passage fails to make the positive case for polygamy. We saw, for example, that the term when 2 Samuel 12:8 says, I delivered them into your bosom, KJV, we saw that doesn't necessarily mean marital relations. We looked over in 1 Kings and we saw the case of Abishag the Shunammite. And it says specifically, it's the exact same phrase, into your bosom, but it's qualified and says right there that he didn't know her, they didn't have relations with her. And it was also pointed out during the Q&A time that when Nathan the prophet, who was making this comment to David, your master's wives were delivered into your bosom, that in that same context, in the same speech by Nathan the prophet, the same phrase is used. That the man who had Nathan is of course using the example of a man who had just one little lamb that he was so close to, and then the bad guy wants his own lamb. Even though he has lots of lambs, he takes the lamb from the guy who only has one. And it says there that it's the same phrase, in his bosom, in his protection. So it's in the same context there. That's one thing we also saw, that the scriptures tell us that you cannot marry a mother and her daughter. And that David had as his first wife, and we'll talk about her a little bit later, Michal, that was his first wife. So if David was supposed to have relations with his wife's mother, that was prohibited. He couldn't do that. So it doesn't work there for marital relations. We also saw the phrase, your master's wives in your keeping, and what the polygamists do is they'll say, well, and he says right there, well, I would have given you much more. Well, what's the much more? It has to be something different. Because if he already has his master's wives, there's only so many you can have. And even in the phrase there, in 2 Samuel 12:8, what it says is, I've given you Jerusalem and I've given you Judah. Well, if you already have Jerusalem and Judah, you can't have much more of Jerusalem and Judah. So it must be something different here. We aren't talking about more wives here. Again, because he said you were master's wives. So it fails there. And so there's all kinds of failures in this passage, which at least one website says is their most obvious case for polygamy. In other words, their most obvious case falls radically short. And we went over that last week, and you can listen to the sermon if you'd like. Now, speaking of listening to the sermon, thank you, Chris, for placing these. Chris, where are you? There you are. Thank you for placing these on YouTube. You've gotten for me what I've called my gaggle of polygamy pals. They are a special group of folks who are taking me to task for some of the things I've said. I am responding to them, and I just did it last night. It's a lot more work than I thought it would be to respond to them, and I've got more responses coming on my YouTube channel, The Joel Saint Show. That's not yet produced. Hopefully, I recorded it, but it's not yet produced. Hopefully, that'll be out here in a couple of days. Hopefully. But some of these folks bring up some terrible points, and some of them bring up some points that are worth considering. And I will address at least some of those during the sermon today. Now, let's get into our sermon today. And my central idea is that monogamy is obligatory. And I've got 4 points to make about that. One of them we just read, but my 4 points are going to be the ownership principle. The second point, the order precept. Number 3, the original purpose. And number 4, the opportunity to hear from the patriarchs. So the ownership principle, we just read about that from 1 Corinthians 7. We'll talk about that in a moment. The order precept from 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. The original purpose, Genesis, and again repeated, as we've referenced before. And number 4, the opportunity to hear from the patriarchs. So we're going to go through all these 4 today. This is not extensive. You could write a book on this. But what I've done here today is brought up 4 points that I believe the Scripture teaches us, that monogamy is obligatory. So we just read from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and I hope you're still there, the ownership principle from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. This is rather intriguing here. And before I read this, one thing I have to say is, one thing that polygamists will constantly say, they will constantly say this, they say it again and again, there's no condemnation of it. There's no condemnation of polygamy. Well, there is a prohibition though. It's prohibited. And I think the condemnation is in the narrative, if you will. The specific condemnation is not there as you might want it to be, just like we don't have the word Trinity in the Bible, but we put that doctrine together based on what the overall Bible says. And it's the same with this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we have a prohibition on polygamy. Let's read it again. Well, we don't read the whole passage. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, verse 2, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. And then verse 4, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Now, what they will do, and I've seen this, is they'll make a big deal out of 2 different words for own in verse 2. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife. The word there, Greek word here, we don't have to get too lost in it, is hiautou, and it's a pronoun. And let each woman have her own husband. That's an adjective. So we have 2 different words there, and they say, well, what we see right there from 2 different words is it's different types of ownership. And what they conclude is, true story here, I'm not making this up, what they conclude is that yes, a wife can have her own husband and no one else can have her, but a husband can have his own wife and he can have more than one wife. Okay. All right. So you got a case. You got a case for a grand total of 2 verses. Because when we get to verse 4, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. An even stronger statement. And guess what? We have the same word, which is idios, which was used in the case of the wife back in verse 2. So if you're going to make the case that, well, in verse 2, we're using 2 different words, well, in a stronger context, because you're talking about your own body here. See, earlier it's a little more general, own wife, own husband, but here now you're talking about your actual body right here. And we're using the same word. But these guys will do that. I was like, 2 different words. Doesn't mean that. Well, we're using the same word in verse 4, own body. Wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And the opposite for the husband and the wife. So, this is a positive case for monogamy. It absolutely is. Does a man, let me ask a question, based on this, Does a man have the right to go out and give ownership of his body to some woman when he doesn't have ownership of his body? He doesn't have it. And same way with the wife. This is a specific prohibition against polygamy, and polygamists can whine about this all they want, but there's no way to get around this. What they do is they divert us. They talk about 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 2. Go 2 verses later. Do you understand? Do you and I understand something? We say things like, forsaking all others, cleave only to her. We say these kinds of, why do we say that? We just make that up out of nowhere? Here's something cool. We're going to have a ceremony, and you got to say something. So how about this? Forsaking all others, cleave only to her. Yeah, well, right. No, we get that from here. Forsaking all others, cleave only to her comes right from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. It's right there. It's the same thing. It's simply, that phrase is simply an application of this. When you got married, my friends, you said, at that marriage ceremony, you said, my body now belongs to my wife, my body now belongs to my husband. They own it. Not making it up. Not saying something that isn't there. It's actually there. We just read it. One of the great problems we have in our modern culture, by way of brief application here, is we've talked about things like committed relationships. You've heard that, right? Well, I live together in a committed relationship. Then we find out it's not committed. I love how people talk about, well, my girlfriend cheated on me. You're already cheating by living with your girlfriend, bro. Cheating's all around. Committed relationship. Committed to what? You don't have a committed relationship when it comes to husband and wife, man and woman, until you qualify under the terms of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Husband and wife. Other than that, it's just a fling. Other than that, it's just fornication. Other than that, it's just something that God says he will definitely judge. But see, even we as a church, we've kind of stood around and we now are playing footsie-wootsy with committed relationship. I've heard this done in so-called Christian churches, so-called Christian contexts. Committed relationship. So we go from husband and wife, which the Bible teaches, to committed relationship between a man and a woman, and now it hasn't stopped there, has it? No, homosex is making its way into the church, but it's okay because it's a committed relationship. We've gotten away from 1 Corinthians chapter 7 here. We've gotten away from ownership of a body. That's our first point today. And you can't use the different Greek words in 1 Corinthians chapter in verse 2 because the same words are used in verse 4 in a stronger statement. This is a specific prohibition against polygamy. Number 2, the order precept. Let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 3. We'll be going to various passages this morning, and we won't look them all up, but some we will look up. 1 Timothy chapter 3. I want to read the passage to you. See what's being said here. 1 Timothy 3. This is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach. Not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous. One who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. Well, that's a qualification for elders, if you will. How about deacons? Likewise, deacons must be reverent, not double-tongued, not given to much wine, not greedy for money, holding the mystery of the faith with a pure conscience. But let these also first be tested. Let them serve as deacons, being found blameless. Likewise, their wives must be reverent, not slanderers, temperate, faithful in all things. Let deacons be the husbands of one wife, ruling their children and their own houses well. For those who have served well as deacons obtain for themselves a good standing and great boldness in the faith which is in Jesus Christ. So, qualifications for deacons and elders, husbands of one wife. Now, I'm kind of intrigued with this. The idea of husbands of one wife shows up 3 times here in the New Testament, well, in these as I call pastoral epistles, if you will. Pastoral epistles being 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, Paul writing specifically to pastors. It shows up 3 times. I want you to notice something here, because Titus is going to elaborate on this a little bit, and I want to make a point about this, about what the requirements are not only of deacons and elders, but of all men. Do you think, and I've heard this, well, this is what I've heard, well, the deacons and the elders are supposed to be the husband of only one wife. That means the rest of us can have more than one wife. Well, we're going to see. We're going to see about that. But before we switch over to Titus, I want you to see something here that's being said. Verse 12, let deacons be the husband of one wife, ruling their children and their own houses well. Remember that he's putting the idea of one wife together with, it's in the same exact context, he's putting it together with the idea of ruling their own houses well. Now, is this just an anomaly? Well, turn over to Titus. Titus chapter 1. We've looked at this before. Verse 6 of Titus 1. If a man is blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of dissipation or insubordination. Let's stop there for a minute. Do you see the same thing happening right here we just saw in Titus with the deacons? Paul is putting together again the idea of one wife, putting it right beside the idea of ruling his house well. Do you see that? Read it again. If a man is blameless, husband, one wife, having faithful children, not accused of dissipation or insubordination. I don't know. Think this might be an indication that if you have more than one wife, you might have a problem ruling your own house well? Maybe. We certainly saw the examples in the past, have we not? Wasn't too easy for Jacob. It made things difficult for Abraham. Elkanah didn't do so much better. And we don't even have the narrative on Solomon. We'll deal with him a little bit later. Certainly David, you want a failure? You want an example of a failure of someone who didn't rule his house well? That'd be David. I think we have an indicator here. But I'm not so much concerned with the indicator. I'm interested in it. I'm more interested in just the flat-out statement that these people have to be the husband of one wife. But does that give permission for everyone else to have more than one wife? I've been challenged on that point. And my response has been, yes. There may be someone, polygamous cultures are everywhere in history, all over the place. Where you see polygamous cultures in retreat is when Christianity is in the ascendancy. That's simply a historical fact, if you will. And so my response has been, if someone were to be tricked into a polygamous relationship, like Jacob was, and that's the question I've been asked. Hey, pastor, hey, Abraham and Jacob are patriarchs. Are you telling me that you would not allow them to come into your church and be members in good standing, in the normal sense, if you will, of your church? And my response is, yes, they could. If they came in that way, yes, they could. But now I've got a question for you, Mr. Polygamist. Would you have them be elders and deacons in your church? You better say yes. And if you do, you're going right against the scriptures right here. Mr. Polygamist. You're going dead set against them. See, your point being that, well, would you have them? I mean, these are patriarchs and they're good and everything he did is right. Yeah, I'd have them as members, but I would not have them as leadership based on what we saw here. I wouldn't do it. And if the polygamist says, no, I wouldn't have them, then where's your point? But that's not even my main point here. Let's keep reading here in Titus. We've looked at this before. A bishop then, verse 7, must be blameless as a steward of God, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but hospitable, a lover of what is good, sober-minded, just, holy, self-controlled, holding fast the faithful word as he has been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and convict those who contradict. So, let's ask ourselves this question. If Paul is laying down special qualifications here, follow me on this, for overseers only, and we make an application that only the overseers are required to follow these directives, and we're also saying that everybody else is not bound to these directives, let's look at what else we're saying. Let's look at this. Verse 6, if a man is blameless, the husband of one wife, okay, yeah, he can have more, having faithful children, not accused of dissipation or insubordination. Are we saying, follow me on this, it's going to take a little bit of time, I'm going to wring this one out for all it's worth. Are we saying that it's quite legitimate for all the other men in the church to have children who are accused of insubordination or dissipation? Is that what we're saying? If we're going to be consistent with our polygamous ideas, that's exactly what we're saying. But that's not all we're saying. Let's keep reading. A bishop must be blameless as a steward of God, not self-willed. Okay? If someone in the congregation is self-willed, only believes himself, can't listen to anyone else, then I as a pastor am supposed to say, that's no problem. The dude's not a deacon or an elder. No problem. Let's be consistent here. Let's keep going. Not quick-tempered. Dude loses his temper. He's an angry man. The Bible has certain things to say about that. Be angry and sin not. Right? Dude's angry all the time. He's got a quick temper. Hey, pastor, is that kind of bad? Do you think he needs to get himself under control? No, not really. You see, he's not a deacon or an elder, so he can be quick-tempered if you want. This polygamy interpretation stuff leads us into an absolute disastrous mess with their statements on, well, the Bible never condemns it. Well, let's keep going. Oh, here we go. Not given to wine. Pastor, this guy comes in, he's drunk. Do we have a problem? Nah. Only if he becomes a deacon or an elder. You get the point. Oh, violent. This guy beats up his wife and kids. He's coming to your church. That's not my responsibility, says I. He's not a deacon, he's not an elder. He can do those kinds of things. You see how foolish and ridiculous this is. And Paul later on says to Titus, be an example in word and doctrine. Be an example. This is an example. You know what an example is? It's something that others are supposed to imitate. That's what it is. Again, you cannot get around this. And I've heard that one. I'm like, well, that's just for the deacons and the elders. Everybody else can be consistent. I guess if you're a pastor and you're a polygamist and you have lots of wives, I guess in that case it's okay to have drunks and violent people and quick-tempered people. I guess that's what you might get in your congregation. You deserve it. The order precept. There's order in the church. And the order flows from the family, and it flows from having one wife. So we have the ownership principle and the order precept. Thirdly, the original purpose. We talked about this briefly last week, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. We talked about that last week, they. But Christ elaborates on this. He actually says the two. So we have further information from Christ here. Christ in Matthew 19, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. The two. That wasn't said in Genesis. It says they shall be one. Now it's the two. And also, here in Mark, for this reason shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. Mark 10:7. And then Ephesians 5:31. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two, again, shall be one flesh. So we have Paul confirming what Christ said, Christ giving us further information, Christ interpreting what the Old Testament had to say about this, what Moses had to say. The original purpose. How perfect was the Garden of Eden? Apparently not too perfect. Or was one man and one wife God's idea? One man, one woman. Was that his plan? As we said before, he certainly could have created as many, he could have had a half a dozen or a dozen wives for Adam. If polygamy is better, and they don't actually argue this as such, but if it's a blessing, as they do argue, and Adam certainly had all he needed, and that's a key word. So let's get off of perfection for a minute. Did Adam have all he needed in the garden? Did he? Or did he not? Did he have all he needed? All he needed. A polygamist would have to say, well, no, not really. And one person, one of my, and I got to get into this a little bit more in another context. One person said, well, who cares if God gave Adam only one wife? Who cares? I'm thinking, that's the way you got to think if you're going to believe in polygamy. That's the way you have to think, right there. Congratulations, you're thinking consistently. God gave Adam only one wife. What's that got to do with anything? I think it has everything to do with it. See, you're not, and I've been thinking about this as I've been going through this series here. I've been thinking about this at home and in my head. You walk around, you think about it, and it's a question I've been asking myself, and I'm going to ask it right now, rhetorically. Is it possible to say that I want a second wife without saying at the same time that my present wife is inadequate? Is it possible to do that? I'll ask the question again. Is it possible to say that I need or want a second wife without at the same time saying that my present wife is inadequate? I don't think it can be done. I've been thinking about this for a while. I don't think you can do it. Tells me something. Eve was adequate. One wife was adequate. That's all he needed. And that's exactly what Adam said. He was so excited when he saw Eve. This is now bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Calls her name Eve. He's so excited to see her. Perhaps Adam should have been saying, wow, pretty cool. We're off to a good start here. Aren't there more where she came from? I guess if he was a good polygamist, that's what he would have been thinking. No, he had all he needed there in the garden. The original purpose, one man, one woman. And if you really want to know, one of the things polygamists will say, well, you can populate the earth better if you have more wives. Now that's nonsense, because if you get all the wives, if you have a nice harem of 300 wives, then there's 299 other guys that don't have a wife. And I don't really know how that works, but we might get to see that play out in China. We just might get to see that. I fear for the future of that nation. With your one-child policy, I don't know if they thought it through or not. If you have a one-child policy, your population will be cut in half in one generation. I don't know if anybody thought about that. I don't know. I truly don't know if they figured that out. I really don't. But then when you're killing off the girls through abortion, which they did because of a one-child policy, we read that they would find out if it's a boy or a girl before the child's born. And if the child was a girl, they'd kill the girl and try again. They did these kinds of things. So they're cutting down on their population even more 1-to-1 because it's the women who have babies. That's like a revelation nowadays, isn't it? Like, we're old school. We believe the women have babies around here. Dinosaurs that we are. Yeah. God told Adam to populate the earth, and he started out with one wife. So enough of this nonsense about how we're told to populate the earth, so let's get all kinds of wives around here. Stop it. That's not the way God set it up. He could have set it up differently. He did not. And as an aside, I won't dwell on this very long, but these polygamists, what we really need is some honesty from at least some of them. Perhaps not all. We need some honesty here. And what am I talking about? Well, at least one case I'm aware of, I was being told about the wonders of polygamy. Companionship for the wife and help around the house and all this kind of stuff. And the wife asked the husband, "What's in it for you?" Come on, men. We know what's in it for us. And what I see again and again is these polygamists will say everything else, but they will not say the one thing that they're really all about. And they'll sound all sanctimonious and, help around the house and, fill the earth with people and companionship. My wife needs companionship. Yeah, your wife needs companionship. Yeah, with you as a husband, I get why she needs companionship, because you're not giving it to her. Come on. Come on, polygamists. Tell us what you really think, but you don't want to. You're scared of it. Come out and say it. Say it in the mic. We know what it's about. It's about sex, but you won't say it. I'm challenging you to say it, but you won't. Finally, then, we have the original purpose. We have the ownership principle, the order precept, the original purpose. And finally, send the opportunity to hear from the patriarchs. Well, wait a second. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. The patriarchs, Abraham, Jacob, David, aren't they the ones that make the case for polygamy? What is wrong with you, Pastor? You're going to try to use them to make the case against it. Well, let's see. Let's take a look. Now, again, we're going to turn to some passages. Genesis chapter 16. Abraham. Abraham comes up all the time. Abraham did it, so can I. Let's see this. Look at the passage. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid, perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband, Abram, to be his wife, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. Question. Yeah, Abram does practice polygamy. Question. Whose idea was it? Wasn't his. Abram was a one-woman man. We are going to see this as we study these patriarchs. Listen to me. Abram, Jacob, one-woman men. We'll look at David. He's perhaps slightly different. The angle on him is a little bit different. But I want you to hear this idea of a one-woman man. We have no indication whatsoever that Abram just rolled out of bed and said, hey, Sarah, I get it. We can't have children. What's Hagar over there doing? Never ever. He only had interest in Sarai, and if you read Abram's view towards his wife Sarah, and later became Sarah, he really loved her, and he loved no one else. Remember him buying the field? He bought a specific field from the Hittites just to bury his wife. He loved her. Abram cannot be used to support polygamy. He was a one-woman man, and it was never his idea to have another wife. It wasn't his idea. One-woman man. How about Jacob? Well, let's go to Genesis 29. Let's just see. Again, looking at the text here. See what it says. Was Jacob a one-woman man? Let's see. Verse 15 of Genesis chapter 29. Then Laban said to Jacob, because you're my relative, and we're going to read a lot here, a few points you want to pick up, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Laban's answer is actually yes, but anyway. Tell me, what should your wages be? Now Laban had two daughters. The name of the elder was Leah. The name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were delicate, but Rachel was beautiful of form and appearance. Now let's just stop there for just a moment. Theologians struggle over that. Rachel's eyes were delicate. Some people say, or some translate, her eyes were weak. It's not the easiest to translate this. Whatever it was, she was somehow unattractive. That we know, because you have the contrast there with Rachel. Let's go on. Now Jacob loved Rachel. Stop there. We're going to find out that Jacob never ever had any interest in any other woman. Rachel only. He loved Rachel. That's not said about Leah. In fact, the opposite is said about Leah, and it certainly isn't said about the handmaids, Zilpah and Zillah, or I forget how to pronounce their names. Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. Laban said, it's better that I give you to her than I should give her to another man. Stay with me. Something we could say about that. Let's move on. Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed only a few days to him because of the love he had for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled that I might go into her. And Laban gathered together all the men of the place, made a feast. And then it came to pass in the evening, he took Leah his daughter and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Laban gave his maid Zilpah as his daughter, gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter, Leah, as a maid. It came to pass in the morning that, behold, it was Leah, and he said to Laban, what is it that you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why then have you deceived me? Laban said, it must be not done. So in our country, to give the younger before the firstborn, fulfill her week, and then I'll give you, basically what I'll do is I'll give you Rachel. Then Jacob, verse 28, did so and fulfilled her week, so he gave him his daughter Rachel as a wife also. Kind of a bummer there. Weddings are a big deal, big feast, the whole thing. You got a big feast for the wrong one. It doesn't really say you got a feast for the second one, the one he really wanted. You can kind of see things are kind of really falling apart here. They're not good. It says he gave her his wife. I don't know if there was any ceremony there at all. Jacob also went into Rachel. He also loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served with Laban still another 7 years. Now, let's look and see how Jacob, we already saw that Leah was Laban's idea, not Jacob's. Let's see who the maids are, because Jacob goes into the maids and has children by the maids. Let's see whose idea that was. The Lord saw that Leah was unloved. He opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Man, we don't even have children yet, and we already have a favorite. Let me ask this question. Is it possible? Is it possible to have more than one wife and not have a favorite? Is that possible? I don't think it is. I don't see how it can be. There are certain things wives do for husbands, and some are going to be better at it than others. And it's going to cause problems, and it caused problems already here. Now, Jacob is your guy for polygamy, but you see the problems here. He already has a wife who is unloved. Some translations actually say hated here. But we move on. So Leah conceived and bore a son and called his name Reuben, for she said, "The Lord has surely looked on my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me." Now we've dealt with this before, but I'm going to deal with it just a little bit. What a thing to say about your firstborn. My life has been affliction. Doesn't really sound like things are working out too well here. Laban messed with this whole thing up. Jacob only wanted Rachel. If Laban wouldn't have done his little bait and switch tactic, we sure don't know that Leah was afflicted prior to this. And she has a baby, now she thinks her husband's going to love her. Oh, what a miserable position her unfeeling father put her in. But let's see. Let's get to my point here. She conceived again, bore a son, and she conceived, verse 33, verse 34, she conceived again, bore a son, and she says in verse 34, "Now this time my husband will become attached to me because I've borne him 3 sons. I'm finally going to win my husband." Called his name Levi, which means attached. Verse 35, and she conceived again and bore a son. It says, "Now I will praise the Lord." She called his name Judah. Then she stopped bearing. Now, here's where it gets interesting with the polygamy thing and whose idea was what. Now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, "Give me children or else I die." Jacob's anger was kindled, aroused against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God who has withheld you the fruit of the womb?" So she said, "Here is my maid Bilhah. Go unto her, and she will bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her." Then she gave him Bilhah, her maid, as wife, and Jacob went in to her. Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Okay, so we saw that Leah was Laban's idea. We now see that Bilhah was never Jacob's idea either. It was Rachel's idea. Why? Because Jacob is still a one-woman man. Let's go on. Rachel says, "God has judged my case. He has also heard my voice, and she gave me a son." Therefore he called his name Dan, meaning judgment. Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. And look at this. "With great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister." What is wrong with you polygamists? That you can't see clearly what's going on here. But you're so arrogant that you think that you're going to be better than the patriarch Jacob. You want to use him as an example of polygamy. We have all this, "With great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister," between these two sisters here that are going at each other. But you're going to do better, right? You're going to be better than Jacob. You're not. When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah her maid and gave her to Jacob as wife. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. So now we have Zilpah in on it. We have 4 wives, if you will. Only one was Jacob's idea. Only one. The rest, Leah, Laban's idea. And the other 2 are his wife's idea. It was never his idea. Jacob was a one-woman man. It's clear here in the text. Jacob, even without having further revelation from God at the time, a one-woman man. How about David? Oh, maybe we can sneak one in on David here. David, man, he just went out and collected wives. That's all he did. Okay, let's concede Jacob and Abraham maybe a little bit. What about David? There's a man who just went out and got wife after wife, right? Slow down. Turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 17. Slow down on this. We have to go quickly here. 1 Samuel 17. This, of course, is the well-known account, David and Goliath. The Philistines, verse 1, gathered their armies together to the battle, were gathered together at Succoth, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Succoth and Azekah in, I can't pronounce that name too well. Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. And we have a description of what a champion the Philistine is. And he mocks the armies of Israel. He says this in the second half of verse 8, "Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. As he is able to fight me then and kill me, then we'll be your servants," etc. And he says, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." Saul, of course, is terrified. He should have been the one to fight the Philistine. It should have been Saul. You might remember his height. He was head and shoulders above everyone else in Israel. He was a tall guy. He was a big guy. But Saul is scared stiff. So along comes David. David, verse 12, was the son of the Ephrathite of Bethlehem, and was the son whose name was Jesse. The 3 oldest sons were fighting. David rises early in the morning, verse 20. He's going to see his brothers. He left the sheep with the keeper and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp of the army, was going out to fight and shouting for the battle. David, verse 22, leaves his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper. He goes to the army and comes and greets his brothers. Then as he talked with them, there was the champion, Philistine Goliath of Gath, and he's mocking and defying the armies of Israel. Verse 24, they're fleeing. The men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich him with great riches." Now watch this. This is what's going to happen to this guy. "Enrich him with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel." So 3 things. David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, "What shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And the people answered him in this manner, saying, "So shall it be for the man who kills him." David isn't just wanting to kill Goliath. He's asking, what do I get out of this? He wants to kill Goliath because he doesn't like him defying the armies of the living God. But he's asking another question. It's all right. What do you get? What do I get out of this? Well, you get riches. You get tax-free status, apparently. And you get the king's daughter to marry. David had a lot of wives, but you know what? The only one he ever actually fought for was Michal, Saul's daughter, his first wife. Again, kind of intriguing to me. It looks like he collected wives here and there, and that really caused some problems in his family, quite frankly, later on, as his sons from the various wives murdered each other. It looks like they weren't really worth a whole lot. He was a disaster as a father. Maybe that's one of the reasons why Bathsheba has Solomon. The rest of his sons were a disaster. None of them could be the king. So Bathsheba has Solomon when David is further along, and David now can maybe teach him a thing or two after his disastrous parenting, especially with Absalom and others. Now, it's not a big deal here, but know this. David only ever fought for one woman. Only one. Moving on. How about Solomon? 700 wives, 300 concubines. Certainly he was not a one-woman man, right? Well, 2 Chronicles 8:11. And Solomon brought up the daughter of Pharaoh out of the city of David unto the house that he had built for her. For he said, my wife shall not dwell in the house of David, king of Israel, because the places are holy whereunto the ark of the Lord hath come. You see that? It looks like Solomon has his 700 wives, 300 concubines. It looks like only one of them gets a wife. He certainly isn't building 1,000 houses. We have evidence that all these men are one-woman men. And here's evidence again. Has all these wives, only one of them gets a house. And Solomon figures it out. At the end of Ecclesiastes, live joyfully. This is Ecclesiastes 9:9. Live joyfully with the wife whom thou lovest all the days of thy life, of thy vanity, which he has given thee under the sun. This is your portion in life. Live joyfully with the wives of your, the wife of your youth. Yeah. You don't think there's prohibitions against polygamy? You have the guy who's the wisest man who ever lived, who had the most wives of anybody I've ever heard of. And you know what his advice is to you, Mr. Polygamist? Live joyfully with the wife of your youth. That's his advice to you. Solomon, who should know, makes the case for monogamy. And if there's any man in the world that should know, it'd be Solomon. Not only that, I'll just throw this one in. You don't need to turn to it. 2 Chronicles 11:21. I was surprised to see this. And Rehoboam loved Maacah, the daughter of Absalom, his cousin, above all his wives and his concubines. He had a whole bunch of wives, a whole bunch of concubines. Even Rehoboam is tuned into just one. All the rest are secondary. I guess they're fun to have around, but he loves one above all his wives. I just don't think it's possible with more than one wife to love one more than the other. And what are the other ones supposed to do? You know who understood this? We won't turn to it. We're way out of time here. There's a guy who understood this. A man who understood human psychology. He understood polygamy. He understood duplicity. He understood lying. He understood humans. I'm talking about our boy Laban. Remember Laban? The guy who started the whole mess with Jacob. We won't turn to it, but you might recall that Laban, after a while, Jacob after a while has managed to gain Laban's wealth through some kind of trick that he did, some kind of animal husbandry he did, and he wound up getting Laban's best animals. Jacob sees that Laban now is angry at him. That's the only thing that really could make Laban angry. He was all about money, and he wasn't about much of anything else. He's losing money. Now he's angry. Never bothered him that he faked out Jacob and lied to him. Anyway, so Jacob sees this. He gathers his whole family together, and they get out of Dodge. It takes Laban 3 days to catch him. If you read the passage, there's something very interesting in the passage. When they meet together, they're angry. And that stinking Laban, he tells Jacob to his face, "It is in my power to hurt you, but your God showed up and told me not to, so I'm not gonna." You know, perpetrators always do that kind of stuff, right? Right then, Laban sort of becomes the victim. You deserve, Jacob, for me to hurt you, but it's not going to happen because your God showed up and told me not to. So I'll be the good guy here and not hurt you like I really can. Am I not a good guy for not hurting you because your God told me not to hurt you? Wow, what a guy, Laban. What a guy. And he's really angry, and he lectures Jacob. You know one of the things he says in his lecture? You can look it up. He's telling Jacob that he's going to be in trouble with Laban if he does certain things. You know one of the things he tells him he better not do? You know what it is? He tells him, you better not take other wives. Why does he say that? Because he knows that if Jacob takes other wives, his daughter Rachel might not be the favorite anymore. He knows this. He knows these things. My friends, in the end, it's almost as if, when we read the text, it's almost as if God made men to be one-woman men. It's almost as if he knew what he was doing when he gave Adam one woman. It's almost as if he knew what he was doing when he said, talks about deacons, elders, and so forth, as examples, be one-woman men. It's almost like he knew what he was talking about. My application this morning, if you're even tempted to get into this lifestyle, to go with these groups of people that do these things, multiple wives, get out. Get out now before you do something that you can't undo too easily. Get out right now. The only way you're going to improve if you can do a better job than Jacob, if you can do a better job than David, if you can do a better job than Abraham, and you can't, get out. Get out right now. Proverbs tells us this: men don't despise a thief if he steals to satisfy his hunger. If he's found, he'll repay. But he who commits adultery sins against his own soul. Point there is that there's certain sins that you can't undo. If you steal something, you can undo that. But if you commit adultery, you can't undo that. If you kill somebody, you can't undo that. Stay away from any kind of sins at all, but especially stay away from sins that you can't undo. Spurgeon talks about the fact from Acts 17 where Paul says, the times of their ignorance God overlooked, God winked at. And Spurgeon makes the case that polygamy was one of those things. You know, I think that makes an awful lot of sense. It looks as if God put up with it in the Old Testament while at the same time telling us what a disaster it was. There are no positive cases of polygamy in the scriptures, in the narratives, none. I just had a conversation with a friend of mine, a pastor friend of mine, Pastor Phil Kaiser. This is what he said to me. He said, we were talking, he said, about polygamy. He said, you know, I grew up a missionary's kid in Africa. I believe it was in Ethiopia. I knew what was coming because there's definitely polygamy going on in Africa. Parts of it, at least. And certainly more at the time. You know what he said? He said, I saw it. I saw polygamy in action. He said, and all it was, again, this is a man who's seen it in action, and a godly scholar and a wonderful pastor. He said, all it was competition and scheming and rivalry. So that's what it was. Why would you introduce that into your life when God has created you one woman man? You know, if God created Solomon a one woman man, and Adam and Jacob and Abraham and Isaac, and I would even argue David, if he created them one woman, man, I think he's got the same idea in mind for you. Pretty sure. Stay away from this lifestyle and those people that would lead you into it to justify their own sinfulness. Shall we pray?